In her second novel, Hot Stew, Fiona Mozley explores an all-too-common issue of a major metropolis.
It had to be Soho, it had to be London, was because there are very few places on earth that have such a kind of discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots. It's really a property novel. It's a novel about a piece of land and a fight over a piece of land. It's about their struggle against eviction, so it's about their home. I really wanted to write a kind of multi-character novel about this issue of this struggle that a lot of people have to find a place to live in a bustling city.
A series of intertwining relationships and unexpected discoveries are explored.
I wanted to have a kind of series of chance encounters as well, and a series of coincidences. I wanted to think of sort of the most extremely kind of testing revelations that you could have about a character and see whether it was possible to forgive.
Hello, I'm Ryan Krull, journalist and interviews editor for Boulevard magazine. On behalf of St. Louis County Library, HEC Media, and Boulevard magazine, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's virtual author interview with novelist Fiona Mozley, who is joining us from Scotland. Fiona, the majority of your new novel, Hot Stew, is set in the Soho neighborhood of London. For folks on my side of the pond who may not be familiar with Soho, can you just tell us a little bit about it?
Of course. So Soho's right in the middle of central London, and in many respects it's the cultural capital of the city. So you've got the financial district on one side, and then you've got Westminster, which is the political district, kind of on another side. And north of the two and sort of in the middle is Soho, and it's a place where there are loads of theatres, lots of cinemas, lots of music venues. When we talk about London's West End, like we might talk about New York's Broadway, what we mean is Soho. And yeah, it's a place that has always been a kind of vibrant cultural centre, and it's also always had a real mix of people. So there have always been lots of immigrants there, and it's the kind of the gay capital of London, and it's also where I guess a lot of the city's red light district is as well. So it's a real mix of things. And yeah, it's just sort of a very bustling centre, and it's quite old, I guess, certainly by American standards. So it's it started being built in the 17th century, so 300-400 years ago.
I have a lot of questions I wanted to kind of ask about Soho and setting and place in the novel, but I think maybe for folks who haven't read it yet, it would probably be helpful to talk a little bit about the plot.
It's really a property novel. It's a novel about a piece of land and a fight over a piece of land. And the piece of land happens to be right in the centre of the city. And it happens to be this very old townhouse, which has a French restaurant in the bottom. And then in the basement there's a kind of a collection of vagrants in a kind of cult. And then upstairs there are a group of sex workers. But really it's about their struggle against eviction. So it's about their home rather than, I guess, their work. I wanted to write a novel where the main characters happen to be sex workers, but we don't really learn a huge amount about what they do on their day-to-day. It's about their fight with their landlady. So I guess that I'm really interested in those kinds of novels that have a sort of seemingly quite banal crux. I guess there are a lot of 19th century novels that centre around a piece of land, a dispute around a piece of land, which seems, at first sight quite dry, but then I'm interested in thinking about how all of the different characters revolve around that central plot point, how sort of their idea of their home or ideas of wealth come into play, and how these different characters connect with each other and rub up against each other.
What about Soho sort of made it the obvious choice for a place to set this property novel?
Yeah.
What about maybe your personal experience, if you have some with Soho, kind of made you really want to spend, years focusing on it?
Yeah, so I lived there for 4 months in the summer of 2013. So I was 25 at the time, and I'd spent a couple of years living in London. I was, living with friends in a house share and working various jobs. And a friend of a friend knew of a room going in Soho, and it was just about in my price range because it was a short-term thing, and we weren't really sure if the landlords had the right permits. So yeah, I was there for 4 months, and it was really at that time that I thought, okay, I want to write about this. But also I really wanted to write a kind of multi-character novel about this issue of property and kind of gentrification and this struggle that a lot of people have to find a place to live in a bustling city. And I did consider kind of writing this novel and setting it elsewhere, and the reason that I really decided it had to be Soho, it had to be London, was because there were very few places on earth that have such a kind of discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots. So I guess New York could be another example, maybe Los Angeles, where you see kind of, extraordinary wealth and also, poverty. I really felt it had to be Soho because it's a place of such extremes, and also because it's got so much history and so many other kind of colliding identities as a district. So I wanted this sort of this messy cast of characters that are all very different and that sort of show us a real slice of society, I guess.
Yeah, that was definitely something I was thinking about as I read the novel. That was just such like a great source of momentum for the novel, that I really love these different folks kind of bumping up against each other.
There are parts of town where one group of people live, and there are parts of town where another group of people live. And there are very few places that have that collision. And Soho is one of those places, I think, because it's a cultural centre. So when you have kind of artists and actors and musicians, you tend to have poverty and then also wealth, because those cultural those cultural events are something that kind of has the potential to unite all aspects of society. Everyone wants to go to the cinema, and everyone wants to listen to music, and so you do get this kind of collision in places like that, I think.
Yeah, collision is the perfect word for it. As you're writing this novel, plots need to arc, there needs to be a climax, characters need to evolve, undergo sort of an epiphany or a change or something like that. But whenever you're centering a novel around place, what is sort of the guiding principle there?
I suppose because I had this question of the struggle over the building. So the momentum came from whether or not the characters would be able to stay, so whether they would succeed in their struggle against their landlady or not. So that's kind of where the momentum came from, I suppose, because there are so many characters. I had to try and make sure that each one had some kind of development or some kind of realization or some kind of progression, even if it was quite minor. So I just tried to pay attention to what each character was doing and what they were thinking and how that was changing over the course of the novel. And then there are moments at which the characters connect or meet, although I didn't want those connections and meetings to, I guess I didn't want them to feel too contrived. So some of them meet in only very tangential ways. Some of them have connections that are very minor. And so I tried to kind of punctuate the momentum of the novel with those encounters. And I wanted to have a kind of series of chance encounters as well, and a series of coincidences, because I feel like that's also something that happens in those kinds of neighborhoods or in those kinds of cities. People bump into each other, and people meet in bars or on the street, and that leads to all sorts of unexpected encounters. So I just kind of I saw it as a sort of a rhythm or a series of kind of I don't know, a series of beats kind of punctuating the novel, all those encounters.
I know like a lot of reviews and just really brief descriptions of the book have said that Precious, who is the sex worker kind of leading the resistance against eviction, she's often described as the protagonist, but this truly is like an ensemble novel. So I was wondering, was Precious the first character that came to you? And if not, who was the first character you kind of had firmly in your mind as you were putting this together?
Yeah, so Precious started as a really minor character, actually. So in the development of the novel, she was always there. She was there from the start, but I didn't realize that she was going to play such a significant role. I think the reason that she does is because she is the most kind of, I guess, likable, such a kind of, it's such a sort of, rubbish word when talking about characters, but I think she probably is. She's the character that I think people feel the most warmth towards. That came out, with discussions with my editor. My editor was really keen on having more Precious, and I realized that she really was the beating heart of the book. And yeah, there definitely isn't one protagonist. There are 6 major characters and over 20 other characters, but it just became clear that she was the driving force. However, I think the first set of characters that I wrote were the characters that are known as Paul Daniels and Debbie McGee. So those are nicknames that they've been given by the people at the local pub, which maybe isn't something that Americans will get, but Paul Daniels and Debbie McGee were kind of TV magicians from the 1980s in Britain. And so these characters that are known as Paul Daniels and Debbie McGee live on the streets, and they perform magic tricks for tips. So people give them this nickname. And that was how I got into the writing of it. So they're quite outlandish characters, but that was the first kind of chapter that I wrote, actually, was them walking into the pub and scooping up people's leftover drinks, and then trying to perform some magic tricks to the people in the pub to get some tips. So that was the way in. And I mean, they're not major characters at all, really.
Yeah, not major, but very memorable. Very. I was always sort of delighted whenever you turn the page and it's one of their sections is the next chapter.
Good. Good. I'm pleased to hear that.
As you were putting together this novel, the different ways that folks interact with each other, the different ways that a specific character grows apart from one character or grows nearer another. Were there any ways that these folks behaved that surprised you as you were writing this, sort of connections that surprised you, developments that really just bubbled up organically?
I think so. I wasn't quite expecting the friendship between Glenda and Bastien to become so strong. So Bastien's like this really, really privileged guy. He's from a very old English family. He's very wealthy. He kind of, he's got everything. He's rich and handsome and young and clever. Reasonably clever. He's not that clever, but he has this chance encounter with someone he sort of knew before, Glenda, who's struggling a bit, and he goes down this sort of route where he just sort of starts to open his eyes to the way other people live their lives, and he just starts to look around him. And I didn't expect that to happen in quite that way. I always knew that he was sort of maybe wanting to reconnect with an ex-girlfriend who sort of is also a friend of Glenda's. And I knew that he was going to sort of try and get to know Glenda to try and reconnect with the girlfriend, but I didn't expect their friendship to become so important. The connection between Robert and Lorenzo also happened in slightly surprising ways for me. So I knew that I wanted Lorenzo's this young guy. He's an actor. He's bisexual, and he has this friend who he's known since childhood, who's this really gruff kind of it's like rough seeming old Scottish man who lives in his block of flats. And he's known him for a really, really long time. And they have, I think, quite a profound connection. But that's tested as there are certain revelations about Robert's, quite quite grim past. And I wanted to kind of test the kind of extent to which forgiveness and reconciliation is possible. So I wanted to see whether it was possible that he could discover these things and still feel the same way about the man. I guess I won't spoil for the readers whether or not that happens, but yeah, I wanted to think of sort of the most extremely kind of testing revelations that you could have about a character and see whether it was possible to forgive.
Also, this idea that I think sort of in the same vein, the folks who would otherwise be like the antagonist, you really get their backstory, you learn a lot about them, which makes them much, more difficult to dislike, to use the sort of, the rubbish paradigm there. But I still love that whenever the person you should not like, you're sort of forced to at least empathize with or understand their story, which makes it much harder to see them as a one-dimensional type character.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that's what I was hoping for.
You have such a sort of beautiful way of repeating words within sentences in a way that is just very sort of lyrical and sort of adds like a real momentum on the sentence by sentence level. Can you maybe just talk a little bit about, we're kind of having this macro level discussion about how characters are connected and that sort of thing, but can you, on the sort of more micro level, talk about how you approach just crafting these sentences?
Yeah, I suppose I do like to try and kind of use techniques like repetition within sentences and within paragraphs, and then within the novel as a whole. So trying to kind of have certain words or phrases that I come back to, just to kind of give it a momentum and give it a rhythm. It's not a technique which I don't know if you're supposed to use this technique as a novelist, but I really like alliteration. So I mean, I think people sometimes object to kind of a lot of alliteration in prose because it's a poetic technique, but I really like it. And I also like to have sentences with surprising rhymes in sometimes. When I was getting into this voice of this novel, and it's a very, very different voice to the one I used in my first novel, Elmet. I suppose because some of the themes in the novel felt so kind of 19th century or Victorian, I found myself kind of almost going into this old-fashioned way of speaking and therefore this old-fashioned way of writing. And I just kind of went with it. If you feel a particular tone coming to you as you're trying to get into a character, then it's good to just go with it. And I also suppose that I tried to vary the voice a little bit from character to character. So Precious, who you just spoke about then, her sections I tried to write quite differently from, for example, the character who's the Archbishop, who's a totally surreal, larger than life character, sort of otherworldly almost. His sections are really verbose, quite elaborate, and I wanted the language to reflect that. Whereas with characters maybe like Precious and also like Bastian, I wanted the language to feel a little bit more everyday, a little bit more relatable, I suppose.
Like the Debbie McGee sections too, kind of had that sort of hallucinatory feel, which
exactly. So there's particularly a lot of repetition in those sections. I think like repetition of words and things, just to kind of give it this sort of swirling overtone.
In the writing, could you sort of nimbly move from like a Bastian section to a Debbie McGee all in one day, or did you have to take a little break in between?
Yeah, no, I found that I would go through phases of writing one character. So I would spend a lot of time writing one character, and then I'd try and move to a different character, and I'd actually find it quite tricky because I did want them to have these distinct voices. But I just tried not to worry too much if I required a break between them, because there were all of these larger than life characters swirling around in my mind. So sometimes I needed to kind of take a step back and take a deep breath and get some distance, and then go into a different style, a different way of thinking, a whole different set of circumstances. So yeah, I'd spend days, sometimes weeks, writing one character, and then I'd move on to another one with a bit of a break in between.
I see. And in that same vein, your first novel was set in Yorkshire, which very different setting than Soho. Can you talk a little bit about that transition?
Elmet, my first novel, was set in Yorkshire in the north of England, and it's a really rural novel, and it's set in a woodland, and there are much fewer characters than in Hot Stew, and it's written in first person from the perspective of one character who's a teenage boy. The word lyrical has been used. I feel like you can't, I can't say say that about my own work, but I guess just to emphasize how different it is from Hot Stew. I always knew that Hot Stew was going to be really different in style. Elmet was quite dark, and Hot Stew is quite lively, or I wanted it to be lively. I wanted it to be gregarious, funny at times. The question was, did I have to have a break? And actually, I started writing Hot Stew the day after I finished Elmet.
Oh, wow.
which was a bit strange, but because I'd had the idea for Hot Stew quite early on in the process of writing Elmet, but I'd promised myself that I wouldn't abandon my first novel and start a new project. I promised myself that I'd finish Elmet before I started anything new. But because of that, it had been actually sort of swirling around in my mind for a few years while I was writing Elmet, and that meant that by the time that I finally finished Elmet, I really just wanted to get down some of my ideas for Hot Stew that I'd been having. So I just went straight into it. And also because I was, I guess, kind of nervous about Elmet. I didn't really think it would get published. I didn't at that point have an agent or anything like that. So I was feeling sort of nervous and apprehensive about the whole process and the thought of sending it off to people and even showing people I knew. So a way of distracting myself from that was to just jump straight in headfirst into a new and totally different project.
Oh, wow, that's very impressive. I have a few things that are sort of questions that I think are slightly more out of left field than what I've been asking so far, but stuff I'm really curious about. Can you talk a little bit about snails and their function or their presence in this novel as, I guess, sort of a motif or maybe a symbol? That I don't want to conjecture any more. I have some ideas, but I'd rather get your take on it, of course.
I love that question. I really love that you picked up on that, and I would love to know your ideas about it. Yeah, so the novel opens with a snail. Partly I wanted to, as I said earlier, I wanted a real comprehensive cross-section of society. So people from all walks of life. So there are plants, lots of plants and animals in Hot Stew, and I guess the lowliest is the little snail. I suppose I chose the snail because of its, its swirling structure. This idea of we start with a snail, which has a sort of spirally shell, and then the novel kind of slowly unfolds. Also, because snails carry their homes on their back, and one of the big themes of the novel, I guess, is home and what home is and what we'll do to fight for our home. And then also because it's a kind of food, not so much in Scotland or England or America, I guess, but certainly in France, it's a delicacy. So I wanted to get in all sorts of imagery around eating and consumption in the novel, because as well as being the cultural centre of London, Soho is also, a real food centre. So I guess there were loads of different reasons for including the snail. Not to give too much away, but there is a bit later on where a slug turns up on somebody's rose. So someone notices a slug on their rose, And that was intended to also be a snail, to really kind of stitch the book together from start to finish. But my editor pointed out that snails don't really come out at that time of year. And I just thought, and I thought about just ignoring that and just having it anyway, because I'd, maybe it's better to prioritize the imagery over the kind of,
verisimilitude.
Yeah, exactly. But in the end, I thought, okay, well, I'll change it to a slug because it's a bit like a snail. What are your thoughts about the snails?
Yeah, well, I also too, I didn't know that there was a difference between a slug and a snail, so that was
right.
that totally worked for me. I just sort of thought of it as this idea of snails. They're mostly known for the fact that they move very slow, which made me sort of think about time and how this novel is really interested in Soho, going all the way back to its founding.
I hadn't thought of that. That's a cool reading. Yeah, I like that.
Nice.
I'm gonna, if people ask me about it again, I'll steal that.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah,
nice.
I'll say that.
I don't think I ever have before asked an author about the cover of their book.
Oh yeah.
But I really, really loved it. I don't know if that's a very good shot of it or not, but it's definitely kind of, oh, hey, very good. Awesome, awesome. There's a hunting sort of depiction. A bird looks like it's either about to get snatched by or about to get away from two hunting dogs. And then the hot stew is kind of graffitied over it in this sort of neon color. So I love the old and the new kind of coming together.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have any control over it simply because they showed it to me and I said, oh my goodness, I love it. Just yes. The designer wrote a really nice little email to explain what she'd done with it. There's a kind of archaic quality to the novel, as I've mentioned a few times. It's got a kind of archaic language and it thinks about history a lot. The designer wanted to use a kind of sort of historical painting, and then also because the swans are mentioned several times, because swans have all this sort of symbolic meaning to do with sort of purity and the opposite of purity, and so they wanted to include that, and then also because there are dogs in the book, and also because just one of the major themes is this kind of eat or be eaten sort of mentality that can exist in these bustling divided cities. So there's a hunting theme throughout, I guess. There's this idea of chasing and being chased, and all of that came together. And then the use of the neon again is because it centers around a protest movement, I guess. It's got a kind of graffiti sort of feel, and then I just absolutely love it. I can't believe it's the kind of cover of my book. I think it's amazing.
You mentioned that the day after you finished your first novel, you started Hot Stew. The day after you finished Hot Stew, did you start your third novel?
No. No, I did not. No, I've since finishing Hot Stew, I've been working on various projects. I've been doing some short stories, and I'm also working on what I hope will be a kind of creative nonfiction project, just for a real change. And I have a couple of ideas for what my third novel will be, but I haven't decided yet which I'm going to pursue. So I know after Hot Stew I had a bit of a break.
Yeah, well, if it's fiction or nonfiction, I really look forward to the third book.
Thank you.
Just to remind folks, the book is Hot Stew. You can buy it locally at Left Bank Books, either in person or online. Fiona Mozley, thank you so much again for doing this. It was really a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been lovely to speak with you.